The curious case of Pakistani cinema. Some might not even like to call it cinema. Some might even like to call it, a mere propaganda tool. Well, that would be the Indian journalist and Indian film critics. But the Pakistani cinema has had a rich culture of genres and a rich culture of filmmaking. It produced dozens of films every year to the point where it stopped producing anything for a good amount of 7 or 8 years in the early 2000s. But the Pakistani cinema is currently in a very huge predicament. Pakistanis don't know what their cinematic or their film-related identity is. Especially in the light of these releases, these big, massive releases from Hollywood, these releases like Top Gun or be that Doctor Strange, the Pakistani film industry, like the Pakistani people, has been having an identity crisis. Pakistani actors and Pakistani celebrities and Pakistani stars have been, requesting and pleading to the people to not watch Doctor Strange and to watch, their movies, whatever it is, Dhamaka Dhamal, or they have been, pleading the public to not watch Top Gun. Adnan Siddiqui, the veteran Pakistani actor, went so far as to make a Photoshop of himself and Tom Cruise and write a whole dialogue underneath it about not learning and still fighting against a big fish like Tom Cruise and a big fish like Hollywood. Pakistani cinema also reflects the state of arts and culture in Pakistan. Arts and culture don't really have any, monetary value in Pakistan, and Pakistani people, to the misfortune of Pakistani people themselves, Pakistani people have don't have that great a passion about film and performing arts in general. Pakistanis don't think of cinema as an art form, but as a leisure activity that they would like to enjoy. That is why films like, Doctor Strange and Top Gun perform massively in Pakistan, and they garner millions of dollars in Pakistan. On the other hand, Pakistani cinema in of itself, like I said, has been suffering from an identity crisis, because ever since the so-called revival of Pakistani cinema, Pakistanis have been, searching for ways to produce original content. Pakistani film producers have been trying to find their own voice, and Pakistani film producers have been trying to, make something that is well and truly Pakistani and does not simply resemble Bollywood. Because we have tried that formula over and over again. Back in the 70s, back in the 60s, when Pakistani cinema had an identity of its own, and maybe towards the latter parts of the 80s, Pakistani cinema had an identity of its own, but it has been lost somewhere in cultural mishaps or somewhere along the way in the lack of management in the industry, and it just could not cope up to compete with industry like Bollywood, which is heavily funded with greater production values, with greater budgets. Pakistani cinema could not stand to compete with it. Then, a few years ago, when tensions in Kashmir were rising up and the Indian government laid siege onto Kashmir, Pakistan stopped the release and the exhibition of Indian films in Pakistan, which basically meant that Pakistani cinema had no competitor, no contemporary, and no rival. And Pakistani audiences then altogether started to abandon the cinema culture and started to abandon how the culture of basically watching movies in a communal experience. Pakistani people gradually went towards becoming a more Netflix-oriented audience and a more streaming service-oriented audience, which pretty much seems to be the case all around the world. And people have reduced attention spans. They would much rather, watch a 40-minute episode sitting at their homes than to watch a 2-hour, 3-hour-long film sitting in a theater that is far from the comfort of their home and that smells like popcorn and body odor. But the communal movie culture in Pakistan has been deteriorating, has been gradually ending, because Pakistani cinema could not cope up with Bollywood, and when the huge void was left behind, the huge vacuum was left behind by Bollywood once their films were stopped from being exhibited in Pakistan, the Pakistani cinema still struggled to find an identity and a place of its own in the cinematic market, in the media market, in the multimedia market, and then Hollywood movies and then these big, massive Hollywood budget projects started to swoop, and films like the MCU, films like Top Gun, films like Mission Impossible, they took the place of, basically filled that vacuum that was left by Bollywood films. Now, Pakistani cinema stands at a crucial point in its history. Right now, matters are very urgent. To prevent this industry from collapsing, some might even argue that the industry has already collapsed. But to prevent this industry from actually collapsing, Pakistani cinema has to do something new, something different. It has to find its own voice. It has to find originality rather than producing banal rom-coms or banal films with, item numbers in them. It needs more films like, Lal Kabootar. It needs more films like Kamli, which was produced, written and directed by Sarmad Khusat, who to my knowledge and to my opinion is probably one of the greatest cinematic minds of Pakistan in the 21st century. But now comes in the bureaucratic sad part. Pakistani filmmakers cannot really be very bold with their content and what they are putting out to the public. It can survive as an indie, closed art house community. Maybe to an extent it can survive as that. But for Pakistanis to produce massive films which have impact over all around the world, basically, it has to go through a lot of censorship and a lot of restraints that are holding the Pakistani filmmakers back. Of course, most of the Pakistani filmmakers, from the work they put out, they seem to lack the creativity or the originality to do, genre-bending stuff like that. But the Pakistani moviegoers know that Pakistani filmmakers like Samar Sultan Khusat and filmmakers like Yasir Jaswal, these people have the potential to produce something that is, out of the ordinary, that, breaks the frame of the typical Pakistani film. But talking about bureaucracy and censorship, films that were produced by Sarmad Sultan Khusat got banned. Films that were directed by there is always the infamous case of the film Malik, which was written and directed by Ashir Azim, who is unfortunately for Pakistan, what a great loss, is now working as a truck driver in the United States of America. So all of this censorship, all of this bureaucracy involved, and all of this stuff that is holding Pakistani filmmakers back is currently hindering the process of the growth of Pakistani cinema. Along with that, the sad part being that the only production house that is currently successful in Pakistan is the Inter-Services Public Relations. Our independent production houses, ISPR, so to speak, our independent production houses lack the capacity or the funding or the prowess to make films that truly stand out. The only Pakistani films that stand out, or the Pakistani television series that stand out, are series and films that are produced by ISPR, that are funded by the military, and we can only get good films with people in uniform. We can't get truly human, truly authentic Pakistani stories out there because of all of these political, bureaucratic, and censorship-related constraints. Obviously, there is a stigma attached to being bold in films and being indifferent in films. People in Pakistan, especially when they hear the word bold cinema, they immediately think that it has something to do with nudity. It has something to do with intimacy between two human beings, which certainly is not that bad a thing. But Pakistani political landscape and Pakistani politics and the culture that resides within Pakistani politics is also hindering the growth of Pakistani arts and Pakistani culture. It has put us back a couple of decades in terms of art and culture as far as it goes, and which is a really sad state of affairs. Now, what the government has to do, obviously it has approved allowances for the film industry in its annual budget this year. Hopefully those get implemented, and hopefully a country that is running short on money real quick and is suffering through a huge budget deficit, a country like that cannot simply very casually afford to finance its filmmakers. But let's hope that government, if not aids the process of filmmaking and the promotion of culture in Pakistan, does not, on the contrary, hinder it as well. And the government should be supportive of the Pakistani cinema, and the Pakistani cinema really needs to make a mark of its own. Because if we are to believe the example set by Hollywood, a country's films and the films produced in a country and about that country really seem to have a great impact towards the image building of that country. Pakistan needs image building, Pakistan needs arts, Pakistan needs cultures, and all the government and the people sitting up top can do currently is step out of their way and let them explore and let them do stuff, promote that culture of making films and promote that culture of creating good quality content and putting it out there, not just in the name of Pakistan, but in the name of content itself and culture itself. We don't have anything that is pop culture relevant. We don't have anything that is part of the Pakistani public consciousness.